Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Live with the Hagley Historian. I am Lucas Clawson, historian at Hagley Museum and Library here in Wilmington, Delaware. And this is coming to you as part of Hagley Museum and Library's Hagley from Home program. Since you can't make it into Hagley, we'll bring Hagley to you. So I'm coming to you live from my home studio here in Wilmington, Delaware. Thanks for joining in today. This is our sixth Live with the Hagley Historian broadcast. So thank you all who have been with me from the start, and those of you who have been tuning in and becoming part of the broadcast as we spun things up. And I'd also like to thank Lucy and my production assistant here behind me. You all can send him letters of thanks later. He's the one who sits over my shoulder and makes sure everything goes well during our live stream, and that he keeps me on my toes. So today, we're going to talk about a subject near and dear my heart in a lot of reasons: Henry du Pont and the American Civil War. This is a topic that I came to, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to this topic in addition to what it's all about. So I'm going to give you an overview of Henry du Pont himself, so a little bit about what he did during the Civil War to keep the state of Delaware loyal to the Union, as well as his role with the DuPont Company, and give you a little bit about what the DuPont Company did during the American Civil War. So without further ado, we shall get into today's talk: Henry du Pont and the American Civil War. This is part of a book that I am currently writing, which the tentative title is Henry du Pont, the Black Powder Industry and Delaware Loyalty during the American Civil War. This is a book that I've been working on through the University of Delaware Press, and we hope to be able to come out with it maybe sometime next year. My goal is to have the draft into the publishers in April of 2021. So be a little bit yet, so we're going to wait and see what happens with the COVID-19 crisis and how that works with the publisher. But at any rate, what I'm talking with you about today is a grand overview of this book that I'm currently working on. Again, Henry du Pont, the Black Powder Industry and Delaware Loyalty during the American Civil War. I came to this topic about 10 years ago now in doing research for Hagley's Civil War exhibit called An Oath of Allegiance to the Union, the DuPont family and DuPont Company in the American Civil War. Whenever I started this project, the first thing I thought was, DuPont, big black powder manufacturer, surely they had a lot to do with the Civil War, and surely someone has had a lot to say about it before me. What more can we say that hasn't already been said, hasn't already been discussed? And so in doing my research on this, I found out there's quite a lot that hasn't been said about DuPont, the DuPont family, and the Civil War, and even more that hasn't been said about Delaware and the Civil War. So this is a pretty wide open topic, and one that I'm glad to be working on, and we'll kind of go through some of this with you today. One of the key people of this exhibition was this guy, Henry du Pont, who served as the DuPont Company president from 1850 to 1889. He was the longest serving DuPont Company president in the entire run of the company from 1802 up until now. He was known as quite the American industrialist throughout the Mid-Atlantic and also throughout the United States. A staunch unionist, so he believed strongly in the Union cause. He was not sympathetic in any way to the Confederacy or Secessionists, and ended up being head of the Delaware Militia from 1861 to 1866. One of the questions that I asked in getting into all this is that Henry du Pont, I found in doing my research on the American Civil War in Delaware, ended up being a pretty polarizing figure. The Delaware General Assembly were dominated by the Democratic Party, who were not Unionists for the most part, or at least not sympathetic to the Lincoln administration. And Henry du Pont keeps popping up as being a thorn in their side in a lot of ways, which we'll get into in just a little bit. But one of the questions I asked is, who is this guy that this Delaware General Assembly doesn't tell him to just get lost? Who is this person that he is so important, or at least is such a polarizing figure that he keeps getting brought up again and again? And so getting into that, why he was such a polarizing figure and why the Delaware General Assembly couldn't just brush him off, it's making for a fantastic book. So here is a bit of why that is so. And let me give you some background information before we get into Henry du Pont specifically to set the stage. So in the 1860 election and during the winter of 1860-1861, there's a lot of national uncertainty. Lincoln's election meant for a lot of people that someone who was thoroughly disagreeable to much of the southern states and people who were slaveholders had now been elected president, and also someone whose policies many people in the United States did not agree with. That he ran first and foremost on a platform to keep the Union together, and if he could end up ending slavery at some point, maybe he would. It's a pretty complicated issue, but suffice to say for our purposes today that there was a lot of uncertainty with his election, which led to the state of South Carolina seceding from the Union and a lot of other states following behind. And this all culminated with the assault on Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861, where Confederates in Charleston Harbor fired on, attacked, and took a federal installation, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. So as you can imagine, this caused a lot of consternation in the United States. What's going to happen? This means war. The immediate response is that President Lincoln called for troops to suppress the rebellion, and from there it all escalated into an all-out war. So nobody knows what's going on in the United States in this period. Nobody knows what's going to happen with war, because as we've talked in previous editions of Live with the Hagley Historian, war is uncertain on a lot of levels because of you never know who's going to win. You don't know how long it's going to last, how much economic devastation it's going to cause. And then politically, the American political parties are so divided over this, it's hard for anybody to coalesce around anything. That Abraham Lincoln was a member of the new Republican Party, which by 1860, that was a relatively new party. And you have a Democratic Party that split into two factions, which we'll get into with more specifics with the state of Delaware. So what's happening in Delaware is in a lot of ways a reflection of the national scene. You've got these splits in the Democratic Party. You have things going on in Delaware that makes it such that it's not a done deal that Delaware is going to go with either the Union or the Confederacy in the very beginning. That two Confederate states sent delegations to Delaware in early 1861 to try to convince the Delaware General Assembly to leave the Union. Delaware ultimately didn't, and I'm going to get into that in just a little bit, but this gives you an idea of why there's a lot of uncertainty going on in Delaware. So one of the things that Delawareans have to think about in all this is that Wilmington and Delaware is an industrial center. So by 1860, Delaware rivaled Philadelphia, or Wilmington, Delaware rivaled Philadelphia in industrial output. The map that you're seeing here on screen is a map, a drawing of Wilmington. It's called a bird's eye view of the city of Wilmington, Delaware, done during the Civil War. And most everything that you're seeing in the foreground are shipyards. This is on the Christina River before it flows into the Delaware River. So Delaware ended up having some of the largest producers of things like military wagons, knapsacks, socks, that there were shipyards in Delaware that produced 2 ironclad vessels the U.S. Navy used, and engines for gunboats, things like that. There were wheat manufacturers or flour manufacturers. And all of that in addition to the E.I. DuPont de Company, which produced black powder. So Wilmington is an economic center, an economic powerhouse in the region. And this is a big concern because economically, people here don't want to see this wiped out. This is a pretty important thing. And part of why they were so concerned is that Delaware is considered a border state. It is literally a state on the border between the United States and the Confederacy. So Delaware on this map is circled in red. And to give you an idea of what the other border states were, this was Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And the border states were states that eventually didn't go out of the Union, but they were slaveholding states, and they were that literal border between North and South. And so people in these states had a lot of reason for concern because what if the war comes to me? What if the war comes here? Because if a war is going to happen, it's probably going to happen in this liminal area, in this border between the two states. And so the state of Virginia ends up having a lot of warfare go on. Maryland, Pennsylvania, a lot in Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, these states that are really close to the border. So they were right in their fears that something could happen here. And so this has got the potential to cause a lot of social, economic, and political disruption. So people in Delaware are pretty concerned about what's going on. A really important point to make is that Delaware was a slave state, that the state of Delaware never ended slavery before or didn't end slavery before the Civil War started. In 1860, the 1860 census, there were 1,798 slaves in Delaware, also a large population of free people of color, a population of 19,829 in 1860. And this is as compared to a free white population of 90,589 people. So this kind of gives you the idea of numbers. There weren't a lot of slaves in Delaware, but Delaware was a slave state, and then this ends up becoming a tremendous issue in the run-up to the Civil War and as the Civil War progressed. In Delaware, the Democratic Party, as I mentioned earlier, ended up running things. They were the dominating party in the Delaware General Assembly. They had the U.S. Senate and the U.S. Representative seats, so they controlled politics within the state of Delaware, but they were divided among themselves over the issues, just like the National Party. So there are two main factions of the Democratic Party in Delaware. One was called the Bayard faction, run by James A. Bayard Jr. He was also called Bayard the Younger. His father had been a United States Senator from Delaware, and he ended up becoming Delaware's United States Senator all the way up until 1863. And his son, Thomas F. Bayard, who later went on to become the American ambassador to the court of St. James, a senator in his own right and a pretty prominent fellow. But during the Civil War, these guys were opposed to the Lincoln administration, and they didn't want outright secession so much as they just did not like the Lincoln administration, and they were pretty staunch on their views on slavery. To them, it's wrapped up in property rights. And another incredibly important point to make in all this is that before the 13th Amendment, slaves were not people, they were property. So a lot of arguments you hear about property rights, this is tied up in it. The issue of slavery is tied up in the whole idea of property rights. And one of James Bayard's arguments in all this is that if the federal government tells us what we can and can't do with a certain piece of property, what's next? And so he felt that it was a slippery slope kind of an argument. They obstructed as much as they could the Lincoln administration and dragged their feet on the issues of war once war started in April 1861 and started spinning up during the late spring and early summer of 1861. The other major party in Delaware was called the Saulsbury faction. And these guys did not like the United States as it was. They were more or less Confederate sympathizers. They did want to see Delaware leave the Union because they felt like the state of Delaware's best economic, political, social interests lied with the Confederacy rather than with the Union. The three main people in this party were Gove Saulsbury, who was the president pro tem of the Delaware General Assembly, the Delaware Senate, Willard Saulsbury Jr., and Eli Saulsbury. These guys were three brothers. And so they were prominent members in the Delaware General Assembly, prominent lawyers in Dover, Delaware, Delaware's capital, and were pretty big movers and shakers, especially in Delaware's lower two counties. So Delaware has three counties: Newcastle County, which is the topmost, where Wilmington is located, Kent County in the middle with Dover, and then Sussex County, which is the lower county. And those of you who have come to Delaware to go to the beaches, most of you go to Sussex County, Delaware, which is where Lewis and Rehoboth, Bethany Beach, Dewey, places like that are located. But the bigger mover and shakers in the Democratic Party were Kent County, Sussex County during that era. So these are the two major parties, again, the Bayard faction and the Saulsbury faction within the Democratic Party. In opposition to them was a loose conglomeration of Republicans, former members of the Whig Party who didn't become Democrats, constitutional unionists, all sorts of small splinter parties. And the two things that held them together was, first and foremost, they did not like the Democratic Party, and secondly, that they wanted to see Delaware not leave the Union and try to do what they could to keep the Union intact as it was. So this is the political situation you get into when the Civil War started. A lot of uncertainty and kind of fractured politics in the state of Delaware. One of the first questions that comes up after Lincoln's call for volunteers to suppress the rebellion is whether or not Delaware can send troops to fight. And so William Burton, the then governor of the state of Delaware, ended up exasperating pretty much everybody within the state, both within his own party, he was a Democrat, and on the other side, because he didn't do anything. He steadfastly tried to do as little as possible because in a lot of ways he didn't know what to do. And one of the issues that he drug his feet on was claiming that Delaware could not legally send soldiers to the U.S. Army because of how Delaware's militia laws were written. In that period, instead of having the National Guard like you have now, you have a series of state militias. Each state had its own militias, and each state had its own laws. So typically, men between the ages of 18 and 45, say, in a lot of cases, were required to show up so many times a year to drill and learn military tactics. And in the case of a national emergency, they could get folded over into the Federal Army to go off and fight. And this had been done during the Mexican War, most recently to the Civil War in the Mexican War in 1846 to 48. But Governor Burton argued that there wasn't a clear law in being able to turn Delaware troops over to the federal government. And part of why he argued this and drug his feet on the issue was that just as there was a big divide between people who wanted to support the Union and Confederate sympathizers, a lot of these people were in the state militias. So you had militia companies within Delaware that wanted to go south and fight for the Confederacy, and some that wanted to stay north. And Governor Burton knew that this was going to be a big problem, so again drug his feet on things and completely exasperated everyone. And at this point, Henry du Pont comes to the fore in things. So Governor Burton did something that unexpected to a lot of people in Delaware by appointing Henry du Pont to lead the Delaware Militia on May 10, 1861. So why Henry du Pont, of all people, to lead the Delaware Militia? One of the main things about Henry du Pont was that he had graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1833, had served a year on active service in Alabama, then at Fortress Monroe in Virginia, then came back home and became part of the DuPont Company. But from the 1830s all the way up to 1861, he had played some sort of a role with the Delaware Militia in the state adjutant general's office, helping make sure that Delaware soldiers knew how to be trained in advising on militia laws, advising on military matters. So he was himself a military man and had a long history with the Delaware Militia. He was also head of the DuPont Company, so he was known as a pretty large industrialist in that period, somebody who had a lot of money. In 1860-61, he was the wealthiest man in Delaware and also the largest landholder in Delaware. So he was someone who was hard to discount. But he, importantly for Governor Burton, was not a Democrat. That Henry du Pont at that point was a member of the Constitutional Union Party, and he opposed in a lot of ways, in a lot of cases, the Democratic policies within the state. So Governor Burton felt like he could check off a lot of boxes by appointing Henry du Pont head of the Delaware Militia. So he's throwing a bone to the other side politically, in addition to appointing someone kind of prominent, keep your enemies close kind of an idea, and someone who wouldn't have a lot of opposition from people in Delaware as being the head of the Delaware Militia. So Governor Burton's Executive Order Number 1 for the Delaware Militia on May 10, 1861 appointed Henry du Pont head of the Delaware Militia. Executive Order Number 2, issued the same day, gave Henry du Pont the power to do everything he felt was necessary to be the head of the Delaware Militia. The thing that Governor Burton did not expect was that Henry du Pont, being the staunch Unionist, immediately issued an order saying that if you're going to receive arms and equipment from the state of Delaware, you're going to have to take an oath of allegiance to the United States. And his second order that went out required all of the militia commanders to send reports back to him saying how many people are in your company, where are you located, how much arms and equipment do you have. This infuriated Governor Burton. It infuriated the Delaware General Assembly even more. So Governor Burton's General Order Number 3, issued 3 days later after his first and second orders on May 10th, took away Henry du Pont's ability to do what he felt was necessary to run the Delaware Militia. So Henry du Pont felt that his hands were kind of tied. He had a pretty important job and took it seriously. It wasn't just figurehead to him, that he took his job seriously to be able to take these guys in Delaware, whip them into shape, being able to roll them over into the Federal Army, because one of his jobs was to train these guys, get them ready for war, but then also help make sure that the state of Delaware was secure. So what does he do as head of the Delaware Militia with his hands tied, essentially? One of the first things that he did was set out to disarm disloyal militias. So because he couldn't really do a whole lot, he was disempowered in a lot of ways as head of the Delaware Militia, he talked to people he knew in the War Department, remembering back to the fact that he was a military man a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, but he also knew a lot of people within the War Department and the Navy Department by virtue of running the DuPont Company, one of the largest producers of black powder in the United States up to that point. So he helped convince the War Department it was going to be necessary to send troops into Delaware to disarm disloyal militias. So the federal government sent a brigade of soldiers under the command of Henry Hayes Lockwood, himself a Delawarean, into Delaware to disarm the secessionist militias and to stabilize things within the state. So Lockwood's troops came in, they went to Dover, occupied the State House for a brief time, swung into Sussex County, back up into Newcastle County. And Henry DuPont had a lovely cover with all this because when people came to him to complain, saying, hey, what's going on? Why are these troops coming into Delaware? He could turn around and say, well, you got to talk to the War Department. They're the ones who did it, not me. So it was a really clever way to neutralize disloyal, or as he saw it, disloyal Southern sympathizing militias within the state of Delaware. One of the next things that Henry DuPont set out to do was to prepare loyal militias to go into federal service. So he set up training camps throughout the state of Delaware, and the image you're seeing is of one called Camp Brandywine, which is here in Wilmington, Delaware. This served the double duty as guarding some of the businesses on the Brandywine as well. But he was able to set up these training camps to help make sure that the Delaware militias that were loyal to the Union could get proper training, could figure out a way to get them proper equipment, and when time came for them to go to war, that they would be ready to do so. Delaware, in the end, provided 8 infantry regiments to the United States Army, 1 troop of cavalry, and 1 battery of artillery. So they ended up seeing service throughout the war, and in pretty prominent places, largely because Henry DuPont helped make sure that they were trained and ready to go. Another thing that Henry DuPont helped with instigating in Delaware was federal supervision of elections, that there were a lot of people in Delaware who were afraid that the Democratic Party would try to keep Republicans in the opposition from voting. And so Delaware Republicans, with Henry DuPont's support, asked for federal supervision of the elections in 1862 and 1864. And this caused a lot of disruption and a lot of dissent in Delaware. I mean, as you can imagine how unpopular it would be then and even now to have an army come in, stand at the polling places and supervise elections within the state. It was just as controversial during the Civil War, even more so because it was during wartime. Many Democrats in the state boycotted the elections, but Democrats largely won nonetheless. One of the things that happened throughout all this was that William Cannon was elected governor of Delaware in 1862, he of the Republican Party, but it was kind of a bittersweet victory because in that period, Delaware's governor did not have veto power. All he could do was try to sweet talk the General Assembly into doing what he wanted. So he could get practically nothing done. And Delaware, during the 1864 election, ended up going for General George McClellan. They ended up sending their electors for General George McClellan along with New Jersey and Kentucky rather than Lincoln. Lincoln ended up winning by a pretty large majority in 1864, but Delaware nonetheless went with the Democratic candidate, which was George McClellan. So it's a pretty controversial thing that Henry DuPont played a pretty large role in helping instigate federal supervision of elections in 1862 and 1864. But the larger goal for him was to make sure that the Union would win the war and that things would go the way of whichever party would carry the war to a successful conclusion. Another interesting piece of all this is that President Lincoln came up with a plan for compensated emancipation. So one of the things he was trying to work on during the war is how do we end slavery and do it in such a way that it sticks, that if he tried to do it by executive order, the United States Congress would end up taking it apart. The federal Supreme Court would end up taking it apart. So one of the things he decided to try was buying out slaves. And he figured the place to start was in Delaware because Delaware had the smallest population of slaves in the Union. And it was still a loyal state. So that was going to be his training ground. So he asked U.S. Representative George Fisher to introduce a plan for compensated emancipation to the Delaware General Assembly in mid-1862. That Fisher did, and it received absolute just opposition from everyone. Again, that the Democratic Party controlled the General Assembly in Delaware. That George Fisher, rather than to see the bill get so decisively defeated, withdrew it in the Delaware General Assembly. What happened in this in the long run, and the larger piece of Delaware's history in the Civil War, is that this pushed Lincoln toward the Emancipation Proclamation. He decided that if he couldn't do a compensated emancipation plan in Delaware, then it most certainly was not going to work in Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, or anywhere else. So this is part of what led to the administration thinking of ways to end slavery permanently. And this is one of the steps in the process that gets you to the 13th Amendment in 1865, which eventually ended slavery. And related to this, and something that Henry du Pont ended up becoming pretty proud of in Delaware, was seeing the U.S. colored troops formed. So this was a way to bring recently manumitted slaves, free men of color, into the U.S. military, that up until the Emancipation Proclamation, it was by and large illegal for the U.S. Army to bring black men into the military, to arm and equip black men. So contrabands become a pretty important part of all this. And so a contraband is a legal distinction on slaves that escaped or were taken by the Federal Army or the Federal Navy during the war as contraband of war, remembering that they are property and not people. So the federal government came up with a plan to be able to take them as contraband of war, anything that would give aid and comfort to the enemy. So if you hear the phrase contrabands, that's what it refers to, these people, these escaped slaves, former slaves. They ended up being used in a big way in the U.S. Navy around Port Royal, South Carolina. The image you're seeing is of contrabands aboard the USS Vermont at Port Royal. Why Port Royal is important is that's where Henry du Pont's brother-in-law, Samuel Francis du Pont, was commanding the South Atlantic blockading squadron. Samuel Francis du Pont had a big change in how he felt about slavery during the war, that he never liked it as a moral issue, but defended it as a constitutional one because it was the law of the land. And as Samuel Francis du Pont wrote, that a hog in Massachusetts has it better than a slave in South Carolina, that he didn't see how bad slavery was until he actually saw it for himself, and convinced a lot of people in the DuPont family to go with him, that for the DuPont family they were not slaveholders, and they were against slavery as a moral issue, but upheld it as a constitutional one. Samuel Francis du Pont's position helped change their minds in all this, and Henry du Pont was proud to be able to get free men of color and escaped slaves, former slaves, into the U.S. military, into the U.S. colored troops. So after the Emancipation Proclamation, the U.S. Army formed an official organization called the United States Colored Troops, and allowed men throughout the Union, black men throughout the Union, and even in the Southeast, to join up. Delaware ended up sending somewhere around 1,000 men into the U.S. colored troops, and so Henry du Pont wrote about this, and it was his job as head of the Delaware Militia to help make sure these guys made it into the Federal Army and that the process was smooth for them in doing so. So Henry du Pont's got a big role with the Delaware Militia, helping again make sure that the state of Delaware stayed in the Union in that way, but also making sure Delaware troops were ready to go out into the field. So let's turn our attention to the DuPont Company. Let me give you a quick rehash on what this was all about. The DuPont Company was founded in 1802 on the banks of the Brandywine here in Wilmington, Delaware, by Henry du Pont's father, E.I. DuPont. They put out their first production of refined saltpeter in 1803, the first black powder in 1804, and in the years before the American Civil War, grew into a national business. And it's all about selling explosives to things like mining, construction, railroads, keeping in mind that this era between 1820 and 1860, when DuPont really came out to be a big business, was whenever you see railroads pushing west, canals pushing west, mines being opened in a big way in the anthracite region of Pennsylvania, ore extraction in Michigan and in the Midwest. So this is where DuPont's really making headway in the American explosives industry. And some facts and figures I'll throw out for you to help you understand what's going on with DuPont. That between 1850 and 1860, the DuPont and other companies did a bit of a study to figure out who's buying their products. So between 1850 and 1860, 80% of all American black powder industry output was for explosive powders. So these were being sold to the mining and construction industries predominantly. But explosives were 80%. Again, this is of the entire output of the American black powder industry between 1850 and 1860. 15% of total national output went to sporting powders. So this is like hunting, recreational shooting, stuff like that. Only 5% of total output between 1850 and 1860 was for government sales. So this is the Navy, the Army, the Revenue Cutter Service, which is the forerunner to the Coast Guard, Indian agencies. So these are people dealing with Native Americans out west. This was considered a government agency during that period. But only 5% of total industry sales went to government work. And this is pretty important leading up to the American Civil War. Because one of the things that the assumptions I made going into this is that the DuPont Company made a lot of money off the American Civil War, and I will argue that they didn't. I don't feel that they made money off the American Civil War, and part of why Henry DuPont acted the way he did during the war, especially in regards to the company, was to help make sure the company didn't go out of business in a time of war. Some other numbers I'll throw at you is about DuPont military sales between 1850 and 1860. So during this same period of that I just showed you the numbers for national sales. So with total sales and what you're seeing on this chart, year by year, total black powder sales. So this is everything that DuPont sold, and then military sales. So this is the monetary value of powder that DuPont sold to the military, and then the percentage of sales that were going to the military. So as you can see from this chart, that from 1850 to 1856, it's less than 10%, and in some cases even less than 1% of DuPont sales going to the military, that this jumps in 1857, and then again in 1859. And part of why you see this up and down, so drastic up and down in military sales, is that it's important to remember that the U.S. military was committed to having a small military during this era, to rely primarily on militias and not a large standing army. So in 1860, the U.S. Army is only about 16,000 men in total, spread out across the entire continent of North America. And since the United States wasn't in a war really, except other than fighting Native Americans out west or the occasional expedition against Mormons, that you didn't really need a whole lot of black powder. So the government would show up, make a big order, and then disappear for a year or two and not make big orders again. And some of the small orders were for things like experimental powders or for fuse powders, things that wouldn't, that you're not going to use a lot of. And one of the things about black powder is that if you keep it well, take care of it, keep it in good conditions, it'll last a long time. So the government didn't need to constantly buy black powder during this era. So the government sales were not a big thing for DuPont. They weren't a majority of the company's business. And that's really important to keep in mind in the run-up to the American Civil War. Another thing to point out is that there's a lot of challenges in making and selling black powder. So it's a pretty labor-intensive industry that between 1850 and 1860, the company ran between 350 and 450 employees, which is quite a lot. That the DuPont Company at that point was as big as it was going to get. It took up about 2.5 miles of the Brandywine, but it's a long and narrow business, not a wide one, literally. It just is right on the banks of the Brandywine. So this is a lot of people to keep employed. And it's also considered a heavy industry, that you have to roll big machinery, keep big machinery in motion, that whenever you make black powder, you're not making 5 or 6 pounds of it, you're making 50, 60, 70, 100,000 pounds at a time. So you need a lot of energy, you need a lot of people, a lot of machinery. So it is in that period classified a heavy industry. And because of this, there's a big cost that's involved. You have big labor costs, but also large costs for raw materials, because one of the main ingredients of black powder is saltpeter, potassium nitrate rather, which you have to get from India. So you have to bring it from almost the other side of the world to get to you. So there's big expenses involved in that. Your machinery, I mean, you're not dealing with a little thing that sits on your desk. You're dealing with huge monumental pieces of machinery. So this is a big cost. It also takes a lot of time to make black powder, that there's 9 separate steps to making black powder, that it takes 3 or 4 days per charge, and by charge, that's if you fill up the first type of the roll mills, which is the first type of machinery in the process of making black powder, that's 1 charge. So to get it from that point to finished powder takes 3 or 4 days. And if you're going to make a batch of, say, 30,000 pounds, it could take up to a week to make a batch of powder. Another thing to keep in mind is transportation, because it is a product that can potentially kill you. People are reluctant to handle it. So that's something to keep in mind with this too, that transportation costs are huge. And also safety, that you've got to handle it safely when you move it, but also handle it safely as you're making it, because you don't want explosions in your factory, you don't want to kill your workers, you don't want to blow your factory apart. So a lot of things to think about in the bigger process of making black powder. One of the first major contributions that DuPont made to the war effort was not just in starting to make black powder for the U.S. government, but realizing that the U.S. was not going to have enough saltpeter to make all the black powder it needed. So again, it came out of India predominantly. Britain dominated Great Britain, or Britain dominated India. So one of the things that you have to think about in all this is how are you going to get it? John Bull knows that prices, or knows that a war's on, he's going to jack prices. So things are going to get really expensive really fast. And so DuPont advised the U.S. government that it's going to be important to get a lot of saltpeter and to get it fast, and that if the U.S. government shows up to the British markets, the prices are going to go through the roof. So DuPont offered to send Lamont DuPont, pictured here, who was one of the main people in the company, to be the purchase agent. That DuPont routinely bought a lot of saltpeter out of Great Britain. So if he showed up to purchase saltpeter, it wouldn't be that much of an untoward thing. That they're used to seeing people like Lamont DuPont, and wouldn't necessarily smell something was up. But if an agent from the U.S. government showed up, they would. So DuPont's mission to Great Britain lasted from October 1861 to January 1862. Lamont DuPont went on behalf of the U.S. government under the auspices of the DuPont Company and bought every bit of saltpeter he could possibly lay his hands on in Great Britain. A wrinkle in all of this ended up being the Trent Affair. So this is a pretty important thing that happened while Lamont DuPont was in Europe. This is whenever the USS San Giacomo stopped the Royal Mail steamer Trent and took off the Confederate diplomats to the court of St. James, to Britain, Mason, and Slidell. And so the British government was not happy about this, that the U.S. Navy stopped the ship and took off these representatives coming from the Confederacy to Britain. So Britain stopped the movement of all military supplies to the United States. Lamont DuPont was not happy because at that point, all of the saltpeter that he had purchased was being loaded for shipment to the United States, and Britain stopped it. He immediately sailed home and had a confab of sorts with Henry du Pont, his uncle, to talk about what was going to happen. They approached the Lincoln administration saying, look, we can't get this stuff out of Britain unless something happens. Lamont DuPont went back to Great Britain and started a plan of transshipping all of the saltpeter that he could from Britain to France and into the United States. But in the interim, the United States made a formal apology to Queen Victoria, and that opened up the movement of supplies back into the military equipment and supplies into the United States. So I can't prove that DuPont had anything to do with the United States making the formal apology, but I can't help but think that it played a large role, especially given that all of the saltpeter that the United States would need to carry on the war was locked up in Great Britain at that point, and DuPont had a large part in making sure that it could all make its way over. Another problem facing the DuPont Company was secessionist seizure of military and civilian property. And an important point that I want to impress upon all of you, and everyone at home repeat after me: DuPont did not, under any circumstances, sell powder to the Confederacy. I repeat, DuPont did not, under any circumstances, sell powder to the Confederacy. This was an issue Henry DuPont felt really strongly about, being the unionist that he was, that he had a stated company policy that as soon as a state seceded, or he even caught wind that you were thinking about seceding, all purchases were stopped to those states. All of the agents in those states were cut off. That was it. End of story, period. He did not want DuPont powder making it into Confederates' hands. But DuPont powder did make it into Confederates' hands, not because the company sold it to the Confederacy, but because the Confederacy confiscated it from DuPont sales agents in the Southeast and took it from military arsenals, forts, other military installations in the Southeast. So the picture you see is of Augusta Arsenal in Georgia, which is one of the many federal arsenals that got captured, and this ended up becoming the place where the Confederacy would set up their black powder works at the Augusta Arsenal. But DuPont was not happy about all of this powder being confiscated, not just because of the moral issue that DuPont powder was going to be used against the United States, but the company ended up having to write off $110,358.27 of powder. This was the value of powder lost by confiscation from civilian sales agents. I mean, this is a tremendous amount. In 1863, the company had to write off. And Henry DuPont was incredibly, absolutely positively infuriated by the fact that they lost that much money in confiscation. And in fact, he tried to pursue a lot of the people who took the powder in federal court all the way up through the 1870s to try to get this money back. And some of it he did, but by and large he didn't get any of it back. But wanted to prove the point to people that you're not going to just take black powder from DuPont and not pay for it without me coming after you in some way. But this is another larger piece of the puzzle in all of this. Working for the government wasn't exactly an easy thing to do because remember back that the government wasn't a terribly good customer, as it were, in the run-up to the American Civil War. But there are a lot of demands and problems that Uncle Sam puts on a company like DuPont in making orders in a wartime situation. So the government made a lot of large orders with short deadlines. They need powder and they need it yesterday kind of a situation. So there's all these overlapping orders that are coming in from the various Army arsenals, and then on top of that, the Navy arsenals. And to complicate things further, the Army and Navy Ordnance Bureaus each had their own separate regulations for what type of powder they wanted, how it needed to be made, how it could be packaged, how it had to be labeled. So there's a lot of moving parts in just keeping up with government orders. The federal government had a hard time paying for goods and services during the war, that by 1862, the federal government realized that this was the most expensive war that they had ever fought, and so they were going to have a hard time paying. That in many cases they didn't pay in cash. They had to pay with complex credit instruments, some of these called certificates of indebtedness, that would get issued to companies. This pushed a lot of smaller operators out of business because they need liquidity. They need cash to be able to pay their suppliers, to pay their labor costs, to pay out all of the costs that are part of the bigger picture of staying in business. A company like DuPont can deal with that. They're a little bit bigger. They have a better liquidity, but that's not an ideal situation, knowing that they're not going to get money up front or that they're going to have to wait a while to get their money. Part of the puzzle, too, for the federal government, this is the first time you see personal income taxes, large-scale taxes on business, all sorts of restrictions and regulations, that at one point the federal government wanted to levy a 24.5% tax on munitions manufacturers, which they all thought were absurd. They were able to get it walked back to a 6% tax placed on civilian sporting powders, but this was still a large tax whenever they're in a wartime situation and they're not used to paying those sorts of things. And the government, in order to force its will, would do what they called right of refusal through inspection. So this was a thing that was built into all government contracts, saying that they could turn down all or part of a powder order. And so if the government didn't get what they thought they were getting, they could just turn down your entire powder order and you had to make it again. So it was a way to push leverage or to push their influence back on the American industry. And then finally, the federal government would try to play one manufacturer off the other to say, hey, look, this guy's selling to me for 10 cents lower than you. Can you beat the price? So this threw the American black powder industry into a bit of chaos, that all the major manufacturers were losing a lot of money trying to keep up with government orders and keep up with everything that's going on. So what do? The four major manufacturers, so it's DuPont in Delaware, Hazard in Connecticut, Oriental out of Boston and Maine, and Smith and Rand out of New York, got together and formed a syndicate. And so they decided the thing to do would be to price fix on the government, to end the government playing them back and forth. They across the industry to set a type of a standard to say we're going to make this type of powder, we're not going to sell it for any lower than this price. The federal government didn't like that, but did a study in 1864 to see if they could nationalize black powder. So could the government take it over? They decided they couldn't. They didn't have the expertise. They couldn't build their own black powder factories. They just didn't have the time. They didn't have the money. They didn't have the people. So it was going to be cheaper for the federal government to play ball, as it were, with the major manufacturers than it was going to be for them to try to do it themselves. So the black powder industry was able to force their will back on the U.S. government over all this. And this was something that Henry DuPont was a main leader in. It's important to point out throughout all this that Henry DuPont is where the buck stopped with the DuPont Company. So nothing happened without him knowing it. Nothing happened without his approval. So all of these policies, everything having to do with manufacturing powder, but then also stuff like forming the price-fixing syndicate on the government, were things that came from his office. So he's one of the lead people pushing this and seeing it through to make sure that it was going to happen. in the grand scheme of things, DuPont made a pretty large contribution to the war effort. In the end, DuPont became the largest producer of black powder for the U.S. Army and Navy during the war, and produced about 40% of all the powder that the government purchased during the war. That in running a 24-hour production schedule, changing some things about how they operated in the plant, they were able to manufacture over 1 million pounds of black powder per year from 1862 to 1864 for government contracts, and they were well on their way to doing that again in 1865 had the war not ended. So this is a pretty important thing, that despite all of the craziness going on, that DuPont did step up to the plate. And this gets back to Henry du Pont, that one of the things he did not want to see is Delaware leave the Union, but he also did not want to see the United States broken up or the Constitution trampled as he saw it. So he wanted to make sure that his company did everything possible to make sure the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy had everything it needed to carry out the war, this being black powder. And let me throw a few sales numbers at you too, that from 1861 to 65, to show you the total sales versus military sales. And you'll notice throughout all this that the highest percentage of military sales as compared to total sales is 62% in 1862. DuPont never stopped selling in the civilian market because that's where the best money was to be made. There wasn't nearly the amount of overhead involved in making explosive powders, but they also didn't want to lose those markets, so they made sure to keep selling to the civilian market. And this is not sporting powder, so this is not selling to people who are hunting and practice target shooting, stuff like that. This is to the American mining and construction industries. These are explosive powders that are making it into that area. And they're important to the war effort too, because you need coal to run trains, you need coal to run ships, you need coal to heat houses. So there's a lot of important stuff going on that DuPont's contributing. So the black powder that's being sold, not just what's going directly to the military, but what's going into other industries is important for the war effort as well. But that's where DuPont's keeping itself afloat, because that's where a lot of their money's coming from still, is from these other segments of the market rather than trying to sell it just to the military. So don't lose sight of the fact that DuPont's not just making powder for the government during this era, that they're also making it in the civilian market and keeping it that way. The war ends in 1865. DuPont's more than happy to let the government out of all of its contracts because it wants to get back to selling primarily to the civilian market. But there's a tremendous problem in that in 1865, the government during the war had purchased way more powder than it needed in the war, so they started selling surplus powder and ammunition at well below market prices. This is a big problem because powder they had purchased from DuPont and its competitors at, say, 21, 22, 23 cents a pound, they were turning around and selling on the open market at 3, 4, 7 cents a pound. So it's a tremendous loss to the government, but they wanted to get rid of it. It's huge to the black powder industry because it severely depressed the market. Why go to DuPont and buy new powder for 28 cents a pound whenever I can buy old ammunition from the government at 3 cents a pound and use it for blowing out rocks or whatever I'm going to do? So this creates a huge problem for DuPont and its competitors. DuPont and the main four continue their syndicate in this period, in part to help divide up territory in the U.S., but also to absorb some of this powder. So you can see on this chart that takes you from 1865 to 75. This gives you the total amount of DuPont sales and the total amount of military sales, but also how much money they sank into absorbing some of this powder back from the government, that DuPont and their competitors got together to keep this powder off the market. So they went to these auctions to buy up everything they could. And as you can see, like in 1866, the U.S. government bought $1,814 worth of powder from DuPont, but DuPont turned around and bought $81,642 worth of powder from the government. So in all of these years, the purchasing from the government goes to less than zero, because DuPont's coming out in the negative for all this, that it's going to be cheaper for them to absorb this powder and keep it off the market than to just let it go. So you can imagine what a problem this is for the black powder industry. So the American Civil War is not just the war itself, but the immediate aftermath, and this has a lot to do with what's going on in the black powder industry and with how people like Henry du Pont act and react. What are the ways that they move to solve this problem in the larger sense? was to form a group called the Gunpowder Trade Association in 1872. So this continued the wartime syndicate and the one that started in the immediate post-war era to absorb all this powder, with the added uh, bit that they were going to divide up territory, price fix within the United States, divide up markets, those sorts of things, which were perfectly legal in 1872. But this is part of the larger story of why the American Civil War is important for DuPont. Henry DuPont and his nephew Lamont DuPont were main players in forming the Gunpowder Trade Association, but Henry DuPont is the main guy in helping to stabilize not only DuPont, but the larger American black powder industry. So to help keep the industry afloat and keep it moving, taking some of these steps, including the drastic steps of spending a lot of money to keep surplus powder off the market. So where we'll start to wind down with all this is that Henry DuPont, remembering that he's not a Democrat, was very much one of the things that the war did for him was made him a lifelong member of the Republican Party. It polarized him and politicized him in a way that he never liked the Democratic Party, in part because of how the Democrats after the war viewed ex-slaves, but then also about how the Democrats after the war approached the aftermath of the war itself. So it's things like making sure that ex-Confederates didn't come to power, those sorts of things. But one of the immediate things that happened in Delaware was a negative reaction to slavery's end. So the 13th Amendment passed the U.S. House and Senate in January 1865, ratified by the states in December 1865. There's an immediate backlash in Delaware, and also other former slave states, and showing or trying to demonstrate that the Republican platform was the party that was going to help these ex-slaves come in and take your jobs, take a lot of your political power away from you. So you see broadsides like the one shown here. And to give you a bit of an understanding, understanding of what is Jim Crow, this is something that starts with blackface minstrelsy in the 1830s with a show called Jump Jim Crow. And Jim Crow ended up becoming like a slang for black people during the era. So a Jim Crow law is a law that in some ways has something to do with black people in the United States. And this later came to apply to former slaves and free people of color. So it's a law that was designed to try to keep them out in some way. So you see copy like this. This is from Pennsylvania, but the sentiment is very much the same in Delaware. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up immediately after the war to help figure out what's going to happen with these ex-slaves, help make sure that they had a place to go, that they could become citizens, that they could, it's like a refugee program in a lot of ways. And this is a gross oversimplification, I know, but this is part of why this is designed and what it's about. But this reads, the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the President, this was Andrew Johnson, and made a law by Congress. Support Congress and you support the Negro, sustain the President and you protect the white man. So keep this in mind. This is pretty raucous stuff that's going on, and this is happening in Delaware in a big way. And so Delaware, in the longer sense, ended up setting the tone for a lot of Jim Crow laws in the United States. Remember that Delaware did not secede from the Union, but it was a slave state. That meant that in the military reconstruction after the war, which is the federal occupation of the former Confederate states, that these states had to rewrite their constitutions, had to allow black men to become citizens as per the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution later, that Delaware didn't have to do all that. Delaware didn't have to rewrite the state constitution, didn't have to go through the Reconstruction. So Delaware ends up passing things like poll taxes for black men, passing land requirements to be able to vote, things that deliberately excluded black men from voting. And because these passed the Delaware Supreme Court after the end of Reconstruction in 1877, a lot of other states looked to Delaware. It passed in Delaware, so maybe it'll pass here. So this sets the tone for what a lot of other states do in Jim Crow in the United States afterwards. Henry DuPont was not happy at all about this, and also in the 1870s at some of the former Confederates coming back to power. That I'm going to leave you with a couple of quotes from Henry DuPont and his disappointment in the war's political outcome. On January 8th, 1866, whenever he saw that a lot of ex-Confederates were being pardoned, coming back to power in their states, he wrote, "I believe there the secessionist's true reward good Missouri hemp administered to the most prominent, had it been promptly done, would have been a caution for the future. And what he's getting at with this is that he felt like these people were traitors, and that instead of being allowed back to the United States, that they should be punished in some way, and some of them should be hanged. Hence the reference back to Missouri hemp, meaning rope. Um, this was a pretty strong opinion, but he felt so passionately about this, and again, the war politicized him in such a way that he held a hard line like this for the rest of his life, all the way to his death in 1889. He became a staunch member of the Republican Party and a presidential elector for the Republican Party up until his death. So again, a pretty extreme reaction, but it's a way the war politicized him throughout all this. And the last quote, which is a lengthy one, but well worth reading out to you today, that he wrote on January 10th, 1875, in reference to the so-called Bourbon Democrats, the Democrats that came back to power, or would come back to power after the end of Reconstruction. He wrote, "The old regime will return someday," meaning the ex-Confederates and the slaveholders. "The country will be ruled by the Secessionists and their dough-faced allies. The rebel debt will be paid, the manumitted slaves paid for, and all the damages and losses caused by the war to the Southern states paid for out of the national treasury, and the men that fought to suppress the rebellion and maintain the government will be spat upon by the rebel powers." So again, this is a really strong statement, but I hope this gives you a sense of how Henry du Pont felt about the war, but then also the outcome and the aftermath. So this is, again, a pretty big thing for him, and then I want you to come away with this from their understanding that Henry du Pont did a lot during the American Civil War to keep the state in the Union, but also politically working with the company, that he's working on a lot of levels, and ends up becoming a pretty important person in the grand scheme of things for Delaware and regional history. So I will here open this up. If any of you have any quick questions, any things you'd like to ask about this, and if you think of something afterwards, feel free to, you can continue commenting in the comment box here on the live stream, or you're welcome to get in touch with me via the Facebook page. I'm happy to answer questions about this. Again, I'm writing a book on it, and I like talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to go on and on and on ad nauseum about it. And while we wait to see if any questions come in, I want to let you know, check out Hagley Museum and Library's Facebook page to find out about other Live with the Hagley Historian programs and other events that are going on, that we're trying our best to keep content rolling while we're shut down. So check out the Facebook page for videos, posts, live stream, other content. Also, be sure to check out our digital archives, our Hagley website, hagley.org. I'm getting ahead of myself here, to find out about when we're thinking of reopening, other things that are there. There's also a Hagley from Home tab, which will take you into videos and other content we're putting together while we're not on site. But if you want to explore some of the resources on the American Civil War, go to the Hagley Digital Archives, and it's located at digital.hagley.org. Then we have a specific Civil War collection, and not everything is there, not by a long shot, because there's so much stuff on the American Civil War at Hagley that this will kind of give you a small overview of what's there and give you an introduction to some of the things which are in our collections. We've got one question here from Peter. With the black powder price fixing within that industry during the war, was the federal government gouged, or did the industry just stabilize powder prices so they were not forced to lose money? And where I'm going with this question is, did the industry reap unreasonably high profits due to price fixing schemes? Peter, that is a fantastic question, and one that I've spent a lot of time digging into. So all the numbers that I have shown you in these tables come from the DuPont Company books, and I wanted to know the answer to this, and so did a pretty deep dive into the company's records to try to ask that question and find it out. And I think that my conclusion based on all that and trying to compare it to the other black powder manufacturers is that they did not gouge the government. Their argument throughout all this is that they wanted to do their best for the government. They wanted to ante up and kick in during this national crisis, but they couldn't do it at a loss. And their argument was that they couldn't go in the red to make black powder for the government. So they felt that their prices were fair based upon what they were having to pay for raw materials, for labor, keeping in mind that all these costs are going up, that as the war progresses, it's more and more expensive to do business. And so as the industry advanced their prices under the syndicate, they felt that it was a measured response based upon how they've had to pay for their costs and to try to recoup their costs. And they argued, and I believe their argument, and looking at the books, I believe it too, is that they weren't gouging the government. They weren't trying to make a profit. They were trying to at least break even with everything that they sold. And one last question, and we'll wrap it up for the day from Ryan. Have I read Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War? I have not, but it is definitely one on my hit list. That I've read a lot about the Union perspective. One of my favorites in all this is Gary Gallagher's The Union War, which tries to climb into the head of why people would want to fight for the Union and support the Union during the war. And I'm always reading more stuff on this, so thanks, Ryan, for the suggestion. I'd like to jump in and take a look at that. Well, everyone, thanks for joining me today for Live with the Hagley Historian. Please join me next week, same time, 10 to 11 a.m. next Friday morning, and we'll dig more into Hagley's collections and great scholarship and other stuff that you can take a look at with us. So be safe, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Take care.